most recent one, where you can see that more than 3 million middle and high school students currently used any tobacco products rather, right? This is the most recent survey that was released. And if you look at high schoolers, it's about 16.5%. And if you look at middle schoolers, it's about 4.5%. So quite significant. So that's all tobacco. So why am I only focusing on e-cigarettes here, right? Why am I not focusing on all tobacco products when I talk about it? And here's why. Because when you look at, I think this is New Mexico data, but I think this is very actually similar to what you see around the country, that what tobacco products are the youth using? And at this point in the year 2023, it's by and large e-cigarettes. Right. So in New Mexico, if you look at this, is the most recent data from the New Mexico Department of Health, about 9% of New Mexico youth report smoking cigarettes, but about 34% report using e-cigarettes. And that's a little bit higher than the US as a whole, where it's about 32.5%. So about the same. But look at this rise. So if I was giving this presentation, 12 years ago in 2011, I would have said that it's about 1.5% of all New Mexico youth that use e-cigarettes. So in just a little over a decade, that's gone from 1.5% to 34%. So exponential increase. Just as the use of combustible cigarettes has gone down, the use of e-cigarettes has just risen, I think, dramatically and very concerningly. And this kind of gives that example. So this blue line here is cigarette use, combustible cigarette use amongst New Mexico 9 to 12th graders. And that has actually gone down steadily from 30% in 2003, you can see, to about 9% in 2019. But this is the e-cigarette use. We didn't really start tracking it until 2015, but you can see how that's just gone up, right? Between 2017 and 2019, it just had this pretty dramatic rise. And that's really why I'm focusing on e-cigarettes, because statistically, youth are much more likely to be using e-cigarettes right now than combustible cigarettes. And some of, this is kind of county-wide data. And I know some of you are from some of these counties, right? So look at Taos County, for example, where over half of all high schoolers report being current e-cigarette users, right? It's almost half in Valencia County, kind of, very high numbers. So you can sort of look at your counties, us here in Bernalillo, while lower down are still at 32%. So quite dramatic, especially in some of these countywide data, when you think about almost half or over half of all high schoolers being current users of e-cigarettes. So I think this is why we need to pay attention to. So what are they? Just a little bit about that. They've gone through evolution, right? The e-cigarettes have really changed over the years. Some of the earliest things that were introduced were what were called this closed system. I think they used to be called cigalikes, because they would be like almost meant to look like a cigarette, which would come with a pre-filled cartridge. Someone would use it, smoke it, and then throw it out. They were often disposable, or at least the cartridge was disposable. They were simple to use. And then came this wave of open system e-cigarettes. And these were pretty complicated, bulky things. I have some pictures of it later if someone's interested in it. I can actually, when I send this out, I can also attach those to it. But some of these open system e-cigarettes were pretty bulky. They were really kind of allowed a user to customize what they were doing by changing the voltage and the wattage, and putting in new sort of cartridges. They were also more complicated to use, right? They were larger, they were harder to use, didn't really look like cigarettes. And then came what are called pod mods, which really became the predominant e-cigarettes used by the youth here in New Mexico and around the country. So interestingly, they use this protonated nicotine formulation that was derived from nicotine salts. So it wasn't freebase nicotine. It was this chemically altered form of nicotine is what's usually contained in their cartridges. I'm using the example of Juul, right, which is the brand that had, the largest market share of e-cigarette use, lion's share of the market share. And then it's had some lawsuits, and currently, apparently, Philip Morris is actually trying to buy out Juul. So you can see what the big tobacco lobby is thinking, unfortunately. So Juul patented something called Juul salt, which modified nicotine with a benzoic acid, allowing for basically higher concentrations in the vape juice. Quicker bioavailability, so it would hit the brain faster, so kind of like quicker buzz, and this is a direct quote from the parent company, the patent application, quote, satisfaction in an individual superior to that of freebase nicotine and more comparable to the satisfaction in an individual smoking a traditional cigarette, right? So this was nicotine that had been chemically altered to essentially make it more reinforcing and mimic that combustible cigarette, as opposed to the other e-cigarettes, which were not as reinforcing. So it was highly addictive, particularly in smoking naive populations. Also came in all these flavors, right? Mint and chocolate and strawberry, to again appeal to youth. And it also reduced some of the adverse user experiences like unpleasant taste or throat irritation. So kind of less aversive experience despite there being lots of nicotine. So I think those things you can already see some of the seductions of vaping or e-cigarette use in youth, and researchers have looked at it. So why do youth use e-cigarettes? Why are they more likely to use e-cigarettes as opposed to combustible cigarettes, right? Which are the kind of the old-fashioned cigarettes. Misperception of safety. Oftentimes youth think that these are safer. Again, because there is no tar, right? We often hear that there is no tar in an e-cigarette, so it must be safe. Actually, one survey, this is about 5-6 years ago, found that about 10% of kids or 15% of kids did not even think there was any nicotine in e-cigarettes, which is clearly wrong. There's more acceptance of indoor and public use, right? Because the smoke isn't coming out. Social aspect, not surprising in this in this age group. Gaining respect of friends, increasing chances of being liked, social status, popularity, looking cool. That's often emerged as a chance why kids use e-cigarettes. Affect regulation, feeling calm, reducing stress or boredom, sensory experiencing, enjoying taste and smell. Studies have consistently shown that youth are significantly likely to use flavored cartridges. Negative factors, health concerns, addiction, were reported as deterrents towards initiating e-cigarette use. Enjoyment, novelty, and marketing. I mean, the marketing and some of the lawsuits highlighted this was really geared towards that young adolescent audience. Slick design, right? Some of these pods look like zip drives on a computer, for example. The flavors and this idea of stealth vaping, where you could be in a public place or in a class, and pull out something that looks like a zip drive and secretly vape, which added to the coolness factor. Have kind of all emerged as reasons why e-cigarette might be seductive to the youth. But it's not, it may be seductive, but it's not safe. I think that the data is pretty clear that there are lots of potential harms of e-cigarettes in the youth specifically. And they fall along, I think, these three main areas. One is its effects on cigarette smoking and downstream use of cannabis. And I'll go into each one a little bit. Respiratory and lung injury. And third, cognitive and neurodevelopmental issues, which I think there is the least amount of data out of all three of these, but I will at least have one slide on it, right? So this is a question that comes up a lot, that what is the link between e-cigarette use and combustible cigarette use, right? I think in adults, the data is a little bit mixed, where there is actually some data showing that many adults can use e-cigarettes as a way to cut down their use of combustible cigarettes. I think the data isn't clear, it's pretty mixed, but there is some data in adults that shows that use of e-cigarette can actually lead to cutting down and even stopping of combustible cigarette use, in which case it can really be a harm reduction strategy. And there is a group of researchers who actually use this same argument in the youth, saying that, well, the reason that combustible cigarette use fell off just as the use of e-cigarette went up is because many adolescents and teenagers use e-cigarettes to stop using combustible cigarettes. But that, as people have looked into it more, does not seem to be the case in the youth, right? It does not seem to be, as according to the CDC, there are no data concerning e-cigarettes for smoking cessation in youth. And e-cigarettes are not recommended for uptake by youth or non-smokers due to potential serious harms from vaping. So what has kind of shown up in adults doesn't show up in the youth, that protective effect of e-cigarettes. In fact, when you look at studies focusing on adolescents, young adults, what you find is that there is a big group of young adults that actually initiate their tobacco use with e-cigarettes and then go on to use combustible cigarettes. And a significant proportion of them become what's called dual users, where they're using e-cigarettes sometimes and smoking combustible cigarettes sometimes. So instead of stopping, it's actually leading to progression of tobacco use. And I've listed a lot of the data here for reference, right? And some that actually I think I want to highlight. So 50% of adolescent dual users, so people who were smoking e-cigarettes and using combustible cigarettes, were still using both at 6-month to 2-year follow-up. An additional 16% had sort of graduated to using combustible cigarettes alone, right? And then perhaps more damningly, data from 2019, e-cigarette use actually predicts the use of combustible cigarette use, with an estimated 3-fold to 4-fold increase in the risk of subsequent cigarette initiation, right? And prior users of e-cigarettes being 3 times more likely to be regular cigarette smokers at the end of the follow-up, right? So again, youth, oftentimes what we find is different from what we find in adults. And when we look at e-cigarette use in the youth, it does not seem to be a means to stop smoking combustible cigarettes. Instead, what we find is that e-cigarette actually predicts future use of combustible cigarettes. So good reason not to think about e-cigarettes as a strategy to help youth stop using other tobacco products. There is also increasing data that e-cigarette use in adolescents, by 14 years of age, actually might be associated with a significant increase in the odds of initiating and consistently using cannabis 2 years later, right? And that cannabis initiation at early age is associated with a lot of adverse things, including an increased risk of psychosis, neurocognitive problems, things like that. So I think this is also something to think about. And I think more studies are ongoing currently to look at this association in more depth. So that's one, right? That the harms fall under kind of the substance use category. The other big harm is the respiratory and lung injury. And here's what I often hear, that, well, there is no tar, e-cigarettes, so they must be safe. In fact, that's not necessarily the case. If you think about e-cigarette aerosol, it contains a number of things. And I've listed some of them, including certainly nicotine. And that's not really the concern in that sense. But also all these ultrafine particles, ones that are often labeled quote unquote food grade. And those might be food grade, but not when they're inhaled, not when they're aerosolized and inhaled. There's really little human experience with inhalation of some of these things, like glycerin, for example, right? Propylene glycol, for example, which are considered food grade, but not necessarily safe when inhaled, which can lead to local inflammation, local immune dysfunction, and there are chemicals linked to serious lung disease, heavy metals. They've been linked to asthma and COPD. And there was a study in 2020 that showed that risk of getting COVID were increased 5-fold in teenagers who vaped versus those that did not. And those adolescents who already have asthma are probably particularly vulnerable to adverse lung effects from e-cigarettes. Right. So in terms of risk stratifying, something to keep in mind of. And secondhand smoke, there isn't a whole lot of data, but I think certainly more studies are warranted to see what is the role of secondhand smoke here. And the third major harm domain is this one. And admittedly, there is the least amount of research looking at cognitive and neurodevelopmental risks from e-cigarettes. But there are some studies showing memory problems and trouble focusing on tasks, impaired cognitive processing, and more mental health problems later in life. But again, I think this is the weakest association for me when I really look at the data. I think there's much stronger evidence for the other two I talked about than this one. But, more research will shed light on it. Next, I want to briefly talk about adverse childhood experiences and social determinants of health. Probably could do a whole talk on this, right? But, perhaps unsurprisingly, both of adverse childhood experiences correlate very heavily with substance use disorders, including cigarettes and e-cigarettes. And perhaps that relationship studies show is even more pronounced amongst ethnic minority young adults relative to non-Hispanic white respondents. Going forward, so it's a strong link. So the more adverse childhood experiences someone has, the higher the risk of them association with any substance use disorder, including tobacco use disorder. And you can see that each increase in the number of ACEs is associated with a 34% higher odds of developing an alcohol use disorder, 47% higher odds of developing cannabis use disorder, and 41% higher odds of developing another drug use disorder. And if you look at some of the risk factors of tobacco, again, these are those social determinants of health that we talk about, aren't they? And these are some of the things that are associated with a higher risk of tobacco use, in adolescence. And you can see things like, LGBTQ youth, or Native American, Alaska Native, psychological distress, low family affluence, low academic achievement, all associated with it. And this is from a large study that was published last year, and you can see. And I think this is where I know some of you are working schools. So I'm going to look at the next slide here. In addition to this, one that I think really comes to mind is peer victimization, bullying. I think we have to focus efforts on it because it's consistently linked to worsened outcomes in youth, especially ones who already had adverse childhood experiences. And there are protective factors. That's the good thing, right? This is from a big study. And look at some protective factors that I think people working in school settings, for example, can play a role in. Having a trusted adult at school, having a trusted adult in the community, knowing cultural language, that connection to the tradition with elders can really be kind of an important thing if those programs can be created. Finally, I want to go into some treatment considerations in the next 5-6 minutes. And again, these slides are comprehensive. They're there for you guys as reference, but I want to also leave time for the case. So if you ask youth who are using e-cigarettes whether they want to quit, many of them say, yeah, but when you ask them, when do you want to quit? Do you want to quit soon? That's much lower, right? About a quarter. Why do they want to quit? Well, it's not so different from adults. The reasons for wanting to quit are negative health risks, social disapproval, not just from friends, but also from family and future employers, limited access, cost restrictions, and understanding harms. So how do we assess, right? Part of that brief intervention is assessment. And I think the 5A algorithm, because they all start with A, is widely used. In this setting. So the first A is ask. Ask about any nicotine use. Cast a wide net. Don't just say, do you smoke cigarettes, right? Maybe ask also about e-cigarettes, pods or mods or Juul or vape pens. I also ask, how do you vape? How strong? How many cartridges do you use? What do you vape? Do you vape cannabis? Do you vape tobacco? Do you vape both? Right? Review risk factors as part of that initial assessment. Who smokes in your house, in your peer group, whether there are any psychiatric illnesses, trauma history, other substance use, confidentiality consideration. So oftentimes, I think I always give the adolescent the option of talking to me alone without a parent or guardian. And I tell them that if I'm concerned about your safety or safety of someone else, I legally, ethically do have to break confidentiality. But I would love to talk to you alone first, to get a good idea about what may be going on. And then we sort of narrow the focus. And if you're not sure, there's a couple of validated instruments that don't take too long, but are worth looking into. And I've included them actually for reference. There's the Hooked on Nicotine Checklist, or HONC, and there is also the Modified Fagerstrom Tolerance Questionnaire, or MFTQ. Both really quick. The honk is really good for people who are kind of, we're not sure if they're dependent or not. But if I'm working with an adolescent who I know already has nicotine use disorder, then the FTQ is going to be more useful. So that's kind of how I break it up. And I've actually included them, both of them, for quick reference for you guys, along with a little slide that goes into the questions to ask as part of that initial assessment that you guys can use as a guide. Then after asking, advising is the second A. I know we generally shy away from advising, but here, with permission, like, is it okay if I give you advice, or is it okay if I share my perspective? And with that permission, giving clear and unequivocal guidance, right? Something like, and this is something I often say, that as your doctor, I want you to know that quitting smoking is the most important thing you can do to protect your health now and in the future. I will help you quit. So that partnership offer. Then the third is assessing motivation for quitting, right? Some motivational interviewing principles, right? Something like the readiness ruler, just to start things off, education, encouragement, exploring pros and cons, and then assisting is the next A, right? That MI change plan. So setting a quit date, setting a new goal, etc. And finally, arranging for treatment and follow-up, which is individualized. And I've actually included a couple of resources here, the Quit Line, as well as the Quit Start app, which is actually, an app that, teenagers can download, and it gives them individualized interventions. And then lastly, a little bit about treatments. So, the most data for, an adolescent in terms of medication treatment is a patch. The nicotine replacement therapy is specifically a patch. And the most data is a combination of patch plus or minus a short-acting form of nicotine replacement therapy, such as a gum or lozenge, plus behavioral support. And behavioral support can take many forms. It can take the form of this brief intervention, checking in, but also evidence-based strategies, right? Like cognitive behavioral therapy, ongoing motivational interviewing, counseling, individual and group, really important to think about. And also things like mindfulness, stress management, physical exercise, social engagement, family involvement. So all of those things ought to be a major part when we're talking about this, right? It significantly enhances outcomes, embedding those strong psychological and behavioral treatments. So don't forget about that. In terms of other medications that we use in adults, there is some data for bupropion at a dose of 150 milligrams twice a day, plus contingency management might actually improve outcomes. A dose less than this does not seem to help. And varenicline or Chantix doesn't seem to be all that useful in the youth. The data has been disappointing so far. So I don't really use Chantix, in the adolescent population. If I'm going to use a medication other than nicotine replacement therapy, I'm going to use bupropion, again, in conjunction with psychosocial treatments. And I've got, a reference slide for any prescribers out there who might want to use it, along with a number of resources, both informational, but also some cool stuff like the Quit Line that many of you know of, the Quit Start app. But then there are all these trainings, like from the American Lung Association, for example, has a free course for healthcare providers, teachers, other community members. There is a sort of a text line by the Truth Association. And the Truth Initiative also has a free curriculum for schools in case anyone wants to explore it. So that's a lot of information, a lot of references, and I will stop here. I think I'm right on time.